The phrase "at their wits' end," it's become part of our modern vocabulary to describe moments of utter exhaustion, confusion, or helplessness. No. But, when we say it today, we mean that we have tried every solution, we've exhausted every resource, and still we find ourselves unable to fix the situation. And it can apply to a parent who's overwhelmed by a child's rebellion, a worker that's crushed under financial strain, or a believer facing just unrelenting trials. Yet few realize that this expression originates from the Bible, specifically Psalm 107, verse 27. Psalm 107, verse 27, here the psalmist describes sailors who are caught in a violent storm at sea, and their knowledge of navigation is useless against the fury of the waves. Their wits, their wisdom and skill have reached their end. Now, the biblical backdrop reminds us that being at our wits' end is not merely frustration, but it's about human insufficiency before God's sovereign power. Now, Psalm 107 is a psalm of thanksgiving. You have some that are psalms of praise, some that are thanksgiving. This is one that is thanksgiving. And it recounts how God delivers his people from various trials. And within the context of verses 23 through 30, the imagery shifts to seafarers on the open sea, vulnerable to the tempest. And there, verse 27 reads, "They reeled and staggered like a drunken man and were at their wits' end." Now remember, the whole purpose of our devotional series on Sunday evenings is to look at those phrases we use or hear commonly and to see what their biblical origin is and what they were originally intended, so that when we do hear them or we do use them, then we're drawn back to God and not to the world. Well, the Hebrew phrase here literally means all their wisdom was swallowed up, and it conveys not only disorientation, but complete futility of human effort. Mariners famed for their skill and their resilience, they find themselves helpless against God's creation. And it echoes Job 28 and verse 12, where wisdom is shown to belong ultimately to God. Now, their nautical knowledge, once their pride fails under the weight of divine sovereignty. In the structure of the psalm, this helplessness, it serves a theological purpose. And that is, it directs the afflicted towards the Lord's deliverance. In fact, this particular psalm, it repeatedly emphasizes the refrain, "Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble." Just look at verse 28. Thus, the wit's end is not the conclusion of the story, but rather the necessary prelude to divine intervention. And the contrast between human wit and divine power could not be sharper. The sailors, though trained and seasoned, they knew to look to the North Star. They knew in calculating the waves and their exact route. But all of this, they stagger like drunkards, overwhelmed by forces beyond their control. They're at their wits' end. Their wisdom, it's swallowed up, it's consumed, it's dissolved, it's meaningless in this. What a picture that is of human frailty. The same truth is expressed in Proverbs 3 and verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not what? Do not lean to your own understanding. When men reach the limits of intellect, strength, and ingenuity, they encounter the beginning of God's mighty acts. You have to come to the end of yourself. You might think of an alcoholic. We have the phrase, they have to what? They have to hit rock bottom before they can really accept or are willing to accept any help. We have to be at our wits' end. We have to allow ourselves to really be consumed to such a degree that we turn to God. Paul echoes this in 2 Corinthians 12:9, where God, he's wanting help. He's got a problem, but God replies with, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is perfected in weakness." The psalm here, it doesn't glorify despair, but it shows that despair becomes the threshold of deliverance. Being at one's wit's end is not evidence of failure, but of a divinely appointed crossroads where human pride collapses and trust in the Lord alone becomes the only refuge. The Lord is our refuge and strength, a very present help in times of trouble. In our modern use of "at their wits' end," the phrase, it carries despair without direction. People, they feel defeated as though reaching the end of themselves means the end of hope. But in the biblical context, the end of human wit is the beginning of divine wisdom. You think of Elijah, overwhelmed and despondent under the broom tree in 1 Kings 19 and verse 4. He was at his limit. Yet God met him with food, rest, and with some gentle guidance. Or you think of Peter sinking in the waves of Matthew 14 and verse 30, crying, "Lord, save me." Human ability had run dry, but that's not the end of it. Christ's hand was near. For believers today, the lesson is clear. Your wit's end moment, whether it's brought on by financial strain, whether it's brought on by your patience being tried thin from a loved one, whatever the case may be, your wit's end moment is not the end of the story, but it's the point where God's power and grace can be most clearly displayed. What we have to do is we have to stop in that moment and recognize the work of God instead of just trying to push through that brick wall that we're never going to be able to get through. Instead of despairing when you reach that breaking point and just throwing your hands up in the air and wanting to give everything up, let it become a turning point where you cry out to God. When you're frustrated, cast all your cares on him, because what? He cares for you. He wants you to come to him. That's what he desires. What's your storm? What wisdom has failed you? God asks you and expects you and invites you to trust in his sufficiency. Friends, being at your wit's end, it's not a curse. It's a grace. It's the mercy of God stripping away false confidence so that you can cling to the rock that never fails. Remember the promise of Isaiah 40 and verse 29. He gives strength to the weary, and to him who lacks might, he increases power. You see, the sailor's skill was swallowed up, but God's steadfast love, it was revealed as he calmed the storm and guided them to their desired haven, there in verse 30 of Psalm 127. If you feel tossed about by the winds of life, take courage. Your Father is not absent. The very waves that terrify you are under his command. He has brought countless saints through the storm, and he will do the same for you. Don't despair at your limits, but rather rejoice that God's power knows no limits. As the New Testament tells us, we are surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses. People who have made it through the storm, not through their own strength though, but relying on God's. The modern world uses at their wits' end to describe hopelessness. But Psalm 107 redefines it as a holy crossroads, the moment when human wisdom fails and divine wisdom prevails. When you find yourself staggering like those sailors, exhausted and bewildered, you're not abandoned, but you are rather in a position of deliverance. The God who spoke to Job out of the whirlwind still commands a storm. He's not frustrated by your weaknesses, but he's glorified through them. As Paul reminds us in Philippians 4 and verses 6 and 7, this is what it reads: "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. Let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Being at your wits' end, it's the place where your prayers rise and your knees fall. His peace descends and his glory shines. So take heart. Your storm is not your undoing, but your unveiling of his grace. And I pray this week, as you go through the trials of life, as we all do, that you'll be reminded of James, who in chapter 1 said, "Brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the trying of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect, lacking nothing." Remember to cry out to God. It says there, if you lack the wisdom of how to deal with these things, ask of God. He's not going to hold anything back. He is going to give the full measure of his grace and of his power to help you deal with it. There is no temptation such as common to man that overtakes us all, but there is a way of escape, and that way is the cross. And if there's anything that I can do to help, I'd be happy to. If you need to respond to the gospel, you can do that as we sing. And if you have sin in your life that needs confession, you can do that as well. Will you stand as we sing together?